My name is Trevor Wishart. I live in York. I was born in Leeds, so I'm quite local. I'm mainly known as a musician, as a maker of electroacoustic music, essentially music which is a recording, which you listen to, which may sound crazy, but if you do that, you can get things into your music like birds singing or traffic or Donald Trump or anything you want. You don't just have to rely on the musicians or performers you know. So that's my main area of activity. I also have a second, completely separate career as a weird improvisational vocalist. So I can make any sound you can imagine with my voice, apart from singing, but I can also do singing. But I'm not going to demonstrate that tonight, you might be probably pleased to hear. Now, I've been asked tonight to talk about this event I did with Michael Banks in Hebden Bridge 48 years ago. So my memory is not so good these years. I've been struggling to remember what it was we did. I had to look at my own little booklet to find out what we were doing. So some of my reminiscences may be completely false, and I'm sure that those of you, any of you of my age have probably got me right. But I'm going to try and cast my mind back to the context in which this event happened. I'm going to give a kind of overview of the times, the late 60s, about the social and political situation, and then the artistic potential and the things that were happening at that time, and then about my own personally being drawn into these things and how it affected my work later. Then talk a little bit about the project itself. I won't talk a lot about the project because the point of the project is to experience it. And you're going to hear that on Sunday if you're in the town. So it seems a shame to spoil it by just talking over it today. But then I'll talk about what happened afterwards as a consequence for this whole kind of work pieces for specific environments and in my own work. And I'll finish by talking about what happened to this movement, the political and social changes that happened and what's happening now. That's a kind of overview of what I'll talk about. So go back to the late 60s. Well, I was born in 1946, and I can remember my mother going to the shops with a ration book. And I remember a special treat that was to have fruit and cream. And fruit and cream was oranges out of a tin with carnation milk. So the 50s began to be slightly more interesting. I stopped wearing tweed jackets and brown shoes, and there were things like Italian restaurants and real coffee. And then gradually other changes happened. There was rock and roll, and then there was seriously interesting British popular music, culminating eventually in the Beatles and the whole Liverpool sound. So that was the sort of popular culture developments in that time. There were also all these interesting political things going on. So in Paris there was the 1968 revolution, students on the streets fighting with the police. It all seemed terribly idealistic and utopian if you were a young person at the time. The famous situationist slogan was, "Imagination has seized control." It sounded fantastic. I'm not sure it did, unfortunately. In America you had all these protests against the Vietnam War, and they spread to Britain. In fact, I was on the famous, I forgot what it's called now, where the American embassy was.
Grosvenor Square.
Sorry?
Grosvenor Square.
Grosvenor Square, yes, I was at the Grosvenor Square demonstration with a very politicized friend of mine who dragged me along, and I was trying to drag him away from the police horses and say, "Hey, don't be a fool." But a lot of young people were highly politicized by that. And you also had the flower-powered dropout thing going on in San Francisco. But the situation for young people was very different. There was virtually full employment. Higher education was free. And this was the time when the first generation of working class kids were coming through university, and I was one of those. And my parents' conception of this thing of being educated was, well, they didn't want their son to work in a factory, like my dad. It would be better to work in a bank. And they left school at 16 and didn't know much about secondary education. Universities were mysterious things they'd never heard of. So when I went to university, it was a completely new world for them. But having been to university, and I spent quite a long time there, in fact, when I was doing this project, I was doing my PhD at the University of York, about 5 years into this period of study. It seemed to me that to have dabbled in European medieval music or Japanese culture or quantum mechanics, because I started my university career studying chemistry, and we started with quantum chemistry, or even computer programming, which I got into. To having done all that, did I really want to go and work in a bank? It seemed a bit of a come down. And this was a sort of, there was a general feeling around with lots of young people. I mean, there are lots of very straight people who just wanted to leave university, get a job and carry on with life as normal. But a lot of people felt, well, do I really want to come out of the university and go and get a job in one of those boring, anonymous corporations? I think I'd rather not have a job at all. Now, I can see that to someone going through university today, this is an outrageous concept, but at the time it seemed really exciting. And in fact, my school friend, who I shared a room with at university, left, he got his degree from Oxford, and then went to live in a caravan in a village nearby, and mend televisions, because he had more control of his life doing that. And he started a thing called Uncareers, which is a kind of directory of jobs that weren't jobs. So, for example, you could go to voluntary service overseas, which you can still do. There was a thing called the Simon Community, which had sheltered places for people who were homeless, and you could go in there and be a warden overnight. You could, for example, find a small bit of land and be a smallholder and live off the land. Or you could start a small sustainable business like mending bicycles or selling organic food. And there are all these possibilities that have not been part of this thing with the system, whatever that was. And all this had a kind of theoretical underpinning. This was the idea that work was coming to an end. Somehow the industrial society developed so far there wasn't going to be any work anymore because everything will be automated and people would have all this leisure time. And this idea goes much further back. Apparently John Maynard Keynes in the 30s had believed that that's what would happen towards the 40s and 50s, because he hadn't bargained with the Second World War and all kinds of other things. But certainly in the 60s, there was a lot of talk of this transition to a leisure society in which people had lots and lots of time where they could indulge in, whether it was serious culture or fishing or whatever they were interested in. And the idea of doing art in the street or taking it out to people was all part of this kind of optimistic utopian vision of the future. So in the arts, these developments are slightly different in the visual arts and theatre and in music. Often when you read about the arts, it's assumed that there's impressionism in visual arts, so there must be impressionism in music. Or there's expressionism in the visual arts, there must be expressionism in music. But this is a ridiculous idea. These two areas are not related at all. So you can argue with me about that, but that's my view. So in the visual arts, the situation was, that at that time there were lots of permanent part-time jobs in art colleges. So you could have a job which was stable with a stable income, but a small income, so you only worked a couple of days a week, and you could spend the rest of the week being an artist. And this was a very good basis for pursuing a career as an artist, as well as teaching and the other responsibilities. And all these new venues started up, which were essentially very flexible venues, like black spaces with lighting and sound equipment and things which you'd drag around the space, and you'd have dance, theatre, film, music, all kinds of things are possible. Places like Bath Arts Workshop, Birmingham Arts Club, the York Arts Centre, they were all over the place. So if you were doing some crazy stuff, you could tour these different venues. And lots of groups and activities came out of art colleges at the time. Now, I mentioned that the Landcape event was a cooperation between myself and Michael Banks, and Michael Banks essentially came out of the visual art of what later became called performance art tradition. There was no performance art at the time, it was invented then. And I guess what Landscape was a site-specific project. There was no such thing as site-specific projects when it was done, but this was one of the origins of this kind of thing. So Mick has sent me some notes about the larger context of this event, because it was part of a festival called Awake. And he was more involved in the setting up and the organisation of that, and also has a more an artist rather than a musician's perspective. So if you excuse me, I'm going to read this little note he sent me about that, because it's not something I really know about. So, the wind of change that blew through the political landscape of Macmillan's post-war Britain blew also through the contemporary arts of the period. Using the Drury Lane Arts Lab as a model, by the late 60s, over 70 arts labs had sprung up throughout Great Britain. These were the manifestation of new ideas in the arts, ideas that could not easily be accommodated by the existing system, ideas that were often not welcomed by the establishment. This new work was described by the Conservative press as experimental. We'll come back to the Conservative press later. The term was used in a derogatory sense, but as one of its leading proponents, Jeff Nuttall wrote in his book Bomb Culture, I've never been experimental in my life. I've always known exactly what I was doing. The national funding body of the day, the Arts Council of Great Britain, was ill-equipped to address this new phenomenon. Founded in 1946 by a post-war Labour government, all its decisions concerning grant aid were made in camera. Its working practice is not open to public scrutiny. Therefore, when it was discovered that a major share of money for the performing arts were allocated to fund the preferred art form of the wealthy, namely opera, and what's changed, it was clear that change was needed. A project group was formed, FACOP, Friends of the Arts Council Cooperative. They acted as unpaid advisors to the New Activities Committee, a body of Arts Council appointees chaired by a toff, Michael Astor, Lord Astor. Their brief to investigate new activities in the regions and see how these might best be funded. In late 60s Britain, regional arts associations were still in their infancy. Hence it was decided to allocate funds to organisations most closely identified with these new activities. They would use the money to fund a series of regional gatherings where new work could be showcased. Birmingham Arts Lab, founded in the early 60s, was an obvious choice as a recipient, and there's a wonderful passage in their illustrated history describing the arrival of Lord Astor in the lab with a cheque for £1,500, having motored up from 105 Piccadilly in his chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce. In 1970, Al Beach and Mick Banks, that's this Mick Banks, founded the Northern Open Workshop at premises in Upper George Yard in Halifax. Jeff Nuttall and John Fox were both teaching at Bradford Art College. Visiting lecturers included Roland Miller and Shirley Cameron, who I've also worked with, and Albert Hunt. Ian White was about to organise the first Bradford Festival. The Yorkshire Vortex was beginning to assert its influence. The Arts Council coughed up the money. And now we found a wonderful venue in the town of Hebden Bridge. And a name, Awake, as in waking to discover a new dawn. However, local people misconstrued this, drawing instead a connection with the Jehovah's Witnesses, which put a wonderful surreal twist on the events of that weekend. As was the case with other gatherings, there was a climate of inclusivity. The same groups would often feature, giving it the character of a travelling roadshow. Some of the best work was site-specific at a time when that phrase was not yet being coined, and this was the context in which Landscape, this event, was created. So that's Mick's take on this for knowing more about the organisation of the festival. and the background in art, and arts establishments. And music, the situation was slightly different. What had happened in music was the evolution of free improvisation. So you've got people coming out of the far end of jazz, and also people coming out of the experimental tradition from essentially from John Cage and people of his ilk, finding that what they wanted to do is kind of coalesced, and you've got this very open, free improvising with instruments and anything. In fact, I used to go, because I wasn't particularly good instrumentalist, I used to go and improvise with chairs or bits of polystyrene, but also with my voice at these events. And there was a movement to set up musicians' collectives, essentially places where these musicians would get together. They'd hire a room in a pub, or they might get a room for free in a pub, with a landlord who didn't mind having funny sounds upstairs. So there was a York Musicians Collective, a Leeds Musicians Collective, and a London Musicians Collective, and several others. And the idea of performing in public spaces grew out also of this political climate and this idea about improvisation. So the first significant public piece I did was called Bicycle Music, where essentially you turned up on bicycles at a place converging from different directions, turned the bicycles over and played them like harps. And I remember doing this outside a concert, a Stockhausen concert, at Leeds Grammar School in 1970. And the police tried to move us on. They suspected we were a political demonstration. So that's a kind of overview of the social context. But from my personal perspective, there's something else involved here. Previously, before coming to York, I was studying at the University of Nottingham, doing an MA, and I was analysing the works of Xenakis and Stockhausen and writing a huge orchestral piece with a complicated mathematical basis and things. And in the middle of this, my father died. And this caused me to reflect, thinking, what has this got to do with anything? So I naively went out and bought a portable tape recorder, a very cheap one, the only one I could afford, and went out making recordings in power stations and factories around Leeds and Nottingham, other places, with no real idea what I was going to do. But they had an electronic studio at York. There was one in York and one in Cardiff, and another one in Scotland. I can't remember where that was at that time. An electronic studio was just 2 analog tape recorders and a lot of leads, none of which seemed to connect anything properly. But this was a great opportunity, and that's why I got into this kind of thing, why I got interested in the environment, the sounds of the environment, doing things outside, and politically wanting to take art somewhere else, because the problem with a lot of this experimental music was it was terribly, terribly exciting and experimental, but its audience, the audience for serious music was like that, the audience for contemporary serious music was like that, and the audience for experimental contemporary serious music was like that. You know, you could count the audience on the fingers of one hand. I thought, this is crazy. You know, what's the point of this? We might think we're really trendy and exciting and experimental, but nobody else is interested in this at all. So let's go and do things outside. Well, on the other hand, that's also slightly crazy, but we'll come back to that. I was looking for some way in which the arts could be taken outside. And so I had 2 revelations by working with other groups. In fact, it was reading the sort of material that my friend was getting when he was setting up the Uncareers thing. There wasn't any internet, that's the important thing to understand. Somehow you had to find alternative publications and strange alternative newspapers, and you would find little adverts about odd things that were going on. And I discovered 2 things, really, that really influenced me. One is the street theatre and play movement, which came out of the United States with Ed Berman, an organisation called Interaction, which would do street theatre and use games to involve people. And their street theatre and their games had a kind of political edge to it. And there was an offshoot of this in Leeds called Interplay, and I went along to work with them. And out of that game, the game structures they used, I thought, well, that's a good way to do musical things. So I developed the musical games, which possibly some of you know. This thing's called Sounds Fun, where you play with various rules. You make musical structures, sitting in a circle, exchanging claps or passing sounds and things like that. And those games became very important later because I was very insistent on doing educational work with my pieces, which to begin with was annoying to people, and then after 15 years became compulsory. You couldn't possibly do a contemporary concert without doing educational workshops. So that was one thread. The other one thing, I read about this strange meeting happening. I think it was in Manchester, and I went along, and this was part of what Mick was talking about, the Arts Council giving this money so that events could be put on. And there I met Michael Banks, and we started talking about this idea of doing things outside. I think he'd done a little bit of this already through the street theatre events. My thing was much more a concept at the time. It needed bringing out. So I'm very grateful I met all these other people who were doing these exciting things. The Awake Festival was in Hebden Bridge, and Hebden Bridge is a very interesting place from an acoustic point of view. It's a natural amphitheatre, and it cries out to be played with sound in some way. So what did we look at in Hebden Bridge? Well, first of all, the topography. So from a visual point of view, we used these huge flags and walked into town, a simple thing. Later at night, using fireworks from the three hillsides and artificial incendiaries behind the tree line. So it probably wouldn't be allowed because of fire regulations today, but so true of a lot of things. Those kind of things from a visual point of view. From a sonic point of view, and probably the most successful part of the sound aspect of the piece was singing from the hillside and projecting the sound over loudspeakers, which were then rotated. These are big horn loudspeakers which you could move around. So that the sound drifted over the town, and you heard different harmonizations or mixes of the different voices. Also something which could probably have been done anywhere was to hang tiny bells from helium-filled balloons. I learned all kinds of practical things in this, like how to hire a cylinder of helium and how to get it somewhere, because I don't drive. A lot of things I had to learn. I'm not just sitting at a table writing notes on a piece of paper. So I made these tiny bells out of bits of aluminium and hung them with nylon fishing wire on these helium-filled balloons, and they floated off over Hebden Bridge. Then there are things about exploiting the local soundscape itself. So one obvious thing was to use the church bells. So we rang the bells in the two churches. Mick is very into military history and military models, and he discovered a couple of guys who flew Tiger Moth planes. So he had those fly over Hebden Bridge. In my exploration of the possibilities, we discovered a serpent, which is like an 18th century or earlier musical instrument, which is not used anymore, which would be absolutely wonderful to play, but it was such in bad condition that it wasn't playable. And finally, there was the ice cream vans. Ice cream vans are the thing that take music and pleasure into a town. I thought, well, how can we transform ice cream vans? So I came up with the idea of just putting different music in them. So we had live musicians and recorded musicians. So the music was slightly incongruous to ice cream vans, like Beethoven's Seventh Symphony was coming out of one of them. And Mick came up with black ice cream. Black ice cream turns out to be very difficult to make. In fact, we should say about this event that this was our first attempt at doing things like this, and Mick freely admits that the firework display was not really up to his latest standards. He later developed fireworks in a big way in this group called the John Bolt Puncture Repair Kit, who used to do these zany, visual theatre performances. And one of the things they did with fireworks was the 21 herring salute. So they hang a fishing line across the front of the stage, and they hang these 21 herrings on, and then using remote control, these herrings would explode. They had fireworks hidden inside them, so all the very posh people sitting on the front row were so, and what was I going to say? The black ice cream. Mick later discovered that the real secret of black ice cream is glycerine. You have to put glycerine in as well to dye. He told me that in confidence later on. But we didn't have access to glycerine at the time. Not nitroglycerine, just glycerine. From my point of view, in later events I started to incorporate these musical games. So as part of the event, we would set up and start playing these games, and therefore people would come along, particularly kids, and join in. So that was a better way of getting this thing to be more related to the environment in which you were doing it. So that seems like a good place for a little musical break. I haven't got any recordings of the material from this original Landcape event. This was before documentation was really a big thing. And the only reason that there is a document is I'm a composer, and composers make documents. But the idea of documenting your work was something that was only just beginning to happen. Now you read about events in absolutely gloriously wonderful documentation. And I have to say, in some cases, the documentation is far superior to the actual event. I can remember going to a German town where there was this incredible event going on with sounds sweeping across the city and all of them. So I went down to listen to it, and I found hidden next to a motorway a couple of loudspeakers under a bit of concrete, which you couldn't hear for the cars going past. But if you read about it in the documentation, it was spectacularly relevant to the situation. So I'm a bit opposed to that. But there happens to be a document here because composers write documents, that's what they do. So, but it's a little bit rudimentary. There are no videos or recordings. But I have here a recording a little bit of the music from a later event. This is called Beach Singularity, which was done on beaches in Lancashire beaches in 1976. We had loudspeakers as well as live performance with us. One of the nicest features of this piece was we had a version of How Much Is That Doggy in the Window? If you noticed, Julian. but in which I introduced recordings of dogs into the thing. So how much is that dog in the window? Whoop. This one, how much is that dog in the window? Whoop, 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 whoop. So the number of dogs on the recording increased. And as the performance went on, all the dogs on the beach came charging up to us. Look at these dogs. Anyway, so what happened afterwards? Well, I've talked about the fact of educational projects becoming compulsory parts of contemporary music events. From my work with Michael, I did more work with Michael Banks. We did a Sonnet Lumière called Sonnet Lumière Domestique. We were both slightly amused by these rather grandiose Sonnet Lumière projects, which were from an experimental theatre performer, were a bit minimal. So you have these very famous people with very plummy voices speaking, and then a light would come on, and then a light would come on. So we did a Sonnet Lumière on a chest of drawers. Sit there, and all kinds of things happened. Like Noddy came out and sang Wagner, and there were white mice, and at the very end, again you couldn't do this now. We used yachting flares, and it's like the chest of drawers was on fire. All this orange smoke bounced out of it, and everyone had to be evacuated from the arts centre because it was very unhealthy. I also did an event called Seaside on the beaches, on Yorkshire beaches, and Beach Singularity, and Forest Singularity is something I did in association with the Open University TAD 292. It was a course in technology and design, which was, for lots of people who took it, were very skilled craftspeople or people who worked in engineering. But they had to do this weirdo course with an artist. It was a little section of what they did. And what we did is we decorated a tree in the wood, and we made these recordings of transformed animals and birds, which we put on cassette recorders. And in the dark, we wandered around the forest with these strange animal sounds, and then we led the audience into the middle of the forest, and so there's all this weird stuff going on around them. Okay, from an arts point of view, what happened to the support for this kind of thing? I remember initially I was doing these things, and I was applying to the Arts Council music panel, and they said, no, this is theatre, apply to the theatre panel. So I applied to the theatre panel, and they said, oh, no, this is music, apply to the music panel. And this happened a lot, so eventually I was passed on to this new entity, the performance art panel. And this kind of experimental work involving many media and lots of it outdoors was funded by the performance art panel. Also, locally, luckily Lord Faversham, who was, I think, chairman of the Yorkshire Arts, was very interested in all this stuff. And the visual arts officer, Michael Dawson, was also a keen advocate. So much so that lots of the performance artists in Britain moved here, and they bought up lots of little cottages, like in places like Triangle, things around it, which at that time were ludicrously cheap. Nobody wanted to live in a cottage with no facilities out in the country. That's a stupid idea. It's like you could buy a country house as well, really, really cheap. But who wanted to live in a country house, for goodness sake? So we know people who bought country houses at the time. So there was this whole community of performance artists living around here. And Yorkshire Arts was quite generous in supporting this kind of thing. So that was a golden era of this kind of activity. And this sort of thing influenced my electroacoustic work, because one of my most well-known pieces, Red Bird, uses environmental recordings of various sorts, machinery. In fact, the machinery are not really machinery, so I shouldn't say that, but it uses voices, it uses animals and bird song. I was going to play an example, but I think I'll probably go on too long if I do that, so I'll skip that. But my work has been influenced by using environmental sounds. I will play another example at the end. So, what happened next? Well, this utopian era suddenly came to an end. A person called Mrs. Thatcher arrived. And the idea of not working, rather than being some utopian ideal, was stigmatized. Social security, which was a social safety net for people in hard times. For example, my dad worked, he was a semi-skilled worker painting tractors in a factory using brushes. And then along came spray cans. So he became an unskilled worker painting tractors in the factory. And then that factory fell on hard times and he was laid off. He'd worked for them for his entire life since he was 18. And he had to take social security. It was a social safety net for those circumstances. He had to go work in another factory and then he got his job back. Soon after he died, the factory closed down. But now there isn't any social security. There's welfare. And people on welfare are obviously scroungers and no good people. They shouldn't even have welfare. So the whole attitude of society towards not working was turned on its head. As far as performance arts went, the press generally didn't really approve. In fact, I remember getting, in the hard times around that, I was appointed through Northwest Arts as a composer in the community in Chorley, but on the job creation programme. That was a serious mistake. And there was this wonderful, and I have to explain, one of my street events involved, one of the little scenarios in it was 3 of us fishing in a bathtub, dressed as gnomes, with 2 people playing brass instruments. And so there was a headline in the Daily Telegraph, "Enter left, gnome playing bicycle." But that wasn't the real demise of it, because I had some commentators coming up some reporters coming up. I was doing this event with people which involved a lot of running about, and I couldn't get these Sun reporters to run about at all. Anyway, this whole, the final straw for the press was Genesis P. Orange, who's also from Yorkshire, he's from Hull. If you know the group Throbbing Gristle, which you probably don't, but I don't know, but famous punk band, and his girlfriend, Cozy Fanny Tutty, put on an exhibition of prostitution at the RCA, which didn't go down too well with the press. In fact, there was some outrage that the Performance Art Panel was closed down. The funding dried up. The strong artistic input into these panels was ridden back. As funding was focused on particular groups who were thought to have a large base or were very successful, and a lot of those groups left the country because there was still lots of work to be had in Holland and Germany. In fact, that's Michael Banks, then in a group called British Events. They moved to Germany and they've only just moved back after 30, 35 years of working in Germany. Mick speaks no German, yet he's managed to make a career just as an artist in Germany, doing the sort of things you're not allowed to do here. So, I said that, now the musical games thing. This whole idea of for me, of getting people to be involved in these musical events where I would get people to make things, so they'd invent things, I'd give sets of crazy instructions and people would make these most remarkable events using the sounds of bouncing footballs and all kinds of things. It's really felt it as some kind of thing to do with releasing your imagination, particularly with children, realising there are all kinds of things you could possibly do which are not in the rule book. You're the master of your own destiny. But what happened in the late 70s, I got invited to all these very well-paid gigs, which I didn't take on, doing creativity workshops, basically for businessmen. Businessmen wanted to be able to expand their businesses. They weren't really interested in transcending improving their spirituality. What they wanted to do is invent a new product to make a lot of money. So the whole orientation of this way of thinking changed. Like the humanistic side of it, the spiritual side of it was completely sidelined. Another development which made it difficult to do public events was the privatisation of public spaces. So before you could go to a shopping centre and do something, and you either didn't get permission, you did it and then the police moved you on, or you could get permission from the council to do it, even if it was slightly crazy. In fact, sometimes it was encouraged because it was, there wasn't anything going on in X town, and even if this was a bit bizarre, when I did the event on the beach in Yorkshire, Scarborough wouldn't want anything to do with anything like that, but Filey and, let me think, where else was it? Whitby, and I can't think where the other place was, but we did it at 3 places, and they thought it was tremendous, Someone's offering us a free gig, why should we say no? But these spaces gradually got taken over by private interests, so you had these big shopping malls with private security men, and often playing music. So the whole environment was controlled. It couldn't be altered in any way, and it certainly wasn't really possible to do anything experimental with them. So the public space just shrinks. And then in the education sphere, this whole thing of part-time secure jobs disappeared. In fact, it's turned on its head. First of all, it was, well, you can only work full-time. You have to commit yourself, you have to be a full-time worker. Now it's, you have to work full-time, but you can't have a permanent contract. We'll only pay you for 11 months, so we don't have to pay any of those extra things. Oh, then we'll re-employ you. Well, you know all about that. So, and even the Open University itself is under threat. You've probably read all this stuff in the paper. It's a really wonderful institution to allow people to enter education at all stages of life, now being threatened by some crazy rationalisation. But let's try and be optimistic as well. So a couple of interesting things is that there is a new open space, which I guess is the internet. Now that's not entirely a positive thing. All this stuff about Facebook and things like that's been happening recently. But it is a place where people can get together and do crazy things without being interfered with. Okay, that can be bad, but it can be good from an artistic point of view. There are mad things going, like people jamming with each other live in Australia and Britain and so on, or setting up pieces where artists in different countries can participate. The other thing that's significant for me is the idea of the end of work has suddenly come up again, but perhaps it's another false dawn. The interesting thing this time is not only have you got the people on the left who want the living wage, so if you don't have a job you still get paid, it's really a way of redescribing social security. It's not welfare, it's a living wage. But it's also coming from people at the other end of the spectrum, people in Silicon Valley, who say, look, the way artificial intelligence is going and so on and so on, there's not going to be, for example, any car industry, there's not going to be many industries, most surgical operations can be done better by robots and so on. That's the way it's going. So what we're saying, there has to be citizens' income, because society will collapse unless people have the income to buy the products we're making. So it's interesting that there's a pincer movement from the left and the right saying that the idea of leisure, or the idea of not working, is going to be an acceptable thing. But we'll see. These things have happened before. So, yes, let's finish with an example, and then we can perhaps have some questions. So my last example, a piece I made between 2008 and 2012, I went into the community in the northeast, lots of towns. I went as far north as almost the Scottish border and down to Newton Aycliffe, making recordings of people talking. And I made a piece, an 8-channel piece, in which I abstracted the sounds of their speech and used that abstracted melodic and rhythmic material to accompany or amplify what they were saying and what they were talking about. So the whole piece is a combination of storytelling and the sound of storytelling. I'm going to play this is the end of my talk, be pleased to know. The final sound example is a guy talking about going to beer festivals in fancy dress. Okay.
Bloody hell, it's a bloke! We normally go to the beer festival. We normally go in fancy dress. We've gone as all sorts of Romans, Frankenstein, bride and groom who went the last year. The bloke! When you all couldn't move for helplessness. So this one year, they made the costumes, the pantaloons and the tops and that. We went as 3 belly dancers, and we had, what was the names? There was Fatty Mark, embroidered on the back, you see, and the yash marks. But because I had more beard than I've got now, she'd put a sleeve in mine, so you couldn't see through it. You couldn't see through it, so you turn up in fancy dress. And all night I had these lads coming, wanting a photograph took with us and everything. And I had a couple of the blokes asking us to dance in Alice, you see. But it's dark in Alice, you see, so it helps. Like, and as the night went on, she was going, what's the matter with you, what's the matter? I said, I want to get in the toilet. We get away at the toilet. At this beer festival place, like communal toilets. And I says, oh no, I've got all these blokes coming up and have my photograph took with me. I says, what's going to happen if I get in the toilet? Like, I get it. She says, I don't get it. So I had to take the yash mic off. So I had to take the yash mic off. I'll give it a couple of minutes and I'll get away in the toilet. As soon as they come off, the ration. It's a bloke! Get there! I've been over there! So I had this yash back in the wheel. Place was an open woman. No, we're coming in there. So just keep it going, bit carry you. And then was Alec who was laughing. That was a Cali dude. Recommended. It's a blow!